The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, welcoming you to the second lecture covering the first movement of Schoenberg's 5 orchestral pieces. Once again, just to remind everybody, I am studying the revision along with you, rather than the 1909 version, just because I feel the revision is a more complete, more final, and much better balanced interpretation of the same material. Let's just jump straight into this without any preliminaries, and I'm going to assume that you have watched the first lecture and just build on what I mentioned before. What I mentioned in the previous lecture is that the very last screen that we studied was really kind of like the beginning of this next section that we're going into, so we are missing a little bit of context for this slow orchestral build, which is going to really pay off on the next screen. So right here, we still have this ongoing D major 7th omit 3 chord that is just tootling along here as if it were just an endless pad being held down by a keyboardist. Now, you are probably wondering how the player is going to be able to just hold this forever. And I would say that would have to be through circular breathing, or it could also just be sneaking a breath here and there. And the players might actually just work that out themselves. Just say, okay, you sneak a breath here and I'll sneak a breath there, and that way we won't both or all three of us sneak a breath at the same time, which really sounds obvious. Of course, sneaking a breath is not such a big deal when you got this divisi cellos sounding randomized, but really quite calculated patterns below, right? At this point, rather than being something like what we see here in the second violins, which we sort of saw beforehand a couple of screens ago, right here, it's just really following into a pattern, isn't it? By the time we get to this area right in here, the second divisi cellos are just constantly playing those same 3 notes over and over, and so are the first divisi cellos. Now, this goes by really quickly, and I would not blame anybody for score reading this page, maybe a developing orchestrator taking a look at it and saying, you know, that doesn't really seem like what I'm reading here. Okay, and it's just because some of the functions are being divided between different groups very, very quickly. Right, so it just really seems as if there is a continuous thread there that is not being seen. So I will mention all that as we go, but let's really jump into what's going on here with the double basses. In my last lecture, I mentioned that Schoenberg is very generous to his double basses, and here we see another example of that. We've got divisi in 3 of the double basses, and this is just really pushing the double basses as loud as they can possibly play, which is not all that loud. To make this line really stand out, Schoenberg would have needed at least the top line to have been doubled by, say, like contrabassoon or whoever's left. You know, there's not a whole lot of people left to double that line and make it clearer. I think that he made the right decision here just to let them stand on their own and to contribute what they could, right? But there's a huge imbalance when we get to here. Fortissimo double basses, forte, pianissimo, accented trombones, right? The trombones would just jump out of that texture, just leap out of it. And then, of course, they die away from pianissimo, so we've got some of that conjoined tone here, but by then you're not even thinking about them. Your focus is going to be on these other Hauptstimme instruments. Like, this doesn't say Hauptstimme, but obviously this is really where the attention is going, and it's marked as if it were in the context of the other instruments or the other bars that are marked Hauptstimme. Okay, so back to the double basses. we're seeing the return of that, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum idea done in three-part harmony. Then, from that point, we see the line being taken over by oboes plus English horn. And of course, the oboes are being doubled by first and second clarinet. Then the violas and first violins intrude into the line, which is why you might get a little lost if you're score reading this yourself and you sort of see this really wonderful line climbing up and it doesn't seem to be expressing itself. It's because it's kind of disjointed, with the winds trading off with the strings very suddenly and then going right back again. And it's really wonderfully scored here. It doesn't really matter that the winds overlap a little bit into where the strings start. That actually kind of helps to keep the line really integrated. And in this case, with music that is totally chromatic, it doesn't really matter so much that there are harmonic clashes. That's just all part of the vibe, right? Then at this point we see the seconds take over, which is why they couldn't help out instead of the violas. But I really do like the viola plus first violin tone, as opposed to just all the violinists playing at once. So at this point, the second violins are sort of previewing a little bit of what we're going to see on the next page. And they just really dig into it. And it's a shame that this line doesn't have more support, because it's just such a thrilling line. But we'll see more of it happening later on, more of that same idea, right? And of course, it just tails off and then, goes down to pianissimo and then grows again with the cellos below it. But let's get back to this Hauptstimme line. So just big hit right here on these Bs, right? And this is also B. And this is also B, right? And this is also B. So they're all hitting this B really, really hard. Meanwhile, trombones are playing this F fifth below, which is so cool. Okay. Then we have another flash of that very percussive, I see this as percussive, this really high, loud piccolo playing that doesn't necessarily rely on consonants for its context, right? So when you take consonants away, having to agree with the pitches below it, then a gesture like this upward leaping slur, can take more of a percussive quality, right, in terms of its function. And like I was mentioning in the last lecture, you listen to this and the context that you might hear this in is stuff from, say, John Williams using things like this in his battle scenes, for instance, for Star Wars. Or he also uses it in comical ways in other contexts. So here we have A2 really weighting down the bottom of this piccolo line, but you do not need A2 piccolos right on top here. That would just really, really shriek. He's avoiding stacking his two piccolos. This might have also given Holst the courage to have a staff with two piccolos on it, right? That would have been a unique idea back in 1909, or was it 1911 when he heard this performed in London. So the line which gets all the weight is an octave below, but that doesn't matter because the overtones will play into what the first piccolo is playing right here on top. And of course, like the E-flat clarinet is playing those same pitches as well. So we've got an off-4 wind line plus the first piccolo on top of that, right? And this lovely shriek, and I think it's made all the more percussive by the forte piano, cuts out, and this line continues on, right? And the horns come in right here and provide more harmonic context below the winds. That's all lovely as this is going on here in the second violins. Now, right here, this comes and goes so quickly. It's one of the things that is not really a weakness, but a regret that I have when I score read this, is that Schoenberg will come up with the most beautiful idea, and it will last for all of a split second, right? Or like a half a second, or maybe 3 seconds or something like that. It'll come and go so quickly. A texture of itself that could have been the basis of a whole episode of another composer, another orchestrator. He just tosses it in there and then he moves on to something else. And that is this lovely idea right in here, which we see worked out in terms of its harmony here in the celesta, right? So if you are a bad transposer or a developing transposer right now, this is the harmonic idea. And this, of course, is going to sound an octave higher. So the beauty of this is that he's got very soft trumpets and trombones, kind of outlining this harmony for the most part. And they are doubling very soft flutes and low Chalumeau register E-flat clarinet. And that is just the most awesome idea if the conductor can get it to balance. And in the recording, you'll hear that the conductor has taken the time. That is Haitink. There's just a little touch of gong behind that. I think this is intended to be tam-tam, but just like a little touch of that gong. That just knocks me out, right? And we've got a little bit of outlining here from the outside. The piccolo is playing an octave higher than the first flute, and that is doubling this line here in the celesta. And you just add this all together. It's a thing that I can imagine Stravinsky thinking about as a orchestral texture and spending 30 seconds on in the middle of some other piece like Agon or some other work. But here it just comes and goes so quickly, and I've already spent several minutes talking about it. That's how much effect that it has on me. And it just shows, once again, part of my thesis about this work is that it is just a grab bag of different powerful orchestral ideas. You know, whatever you may think about the techniques harmonically that Schoenberg is using, or actually avoiding, atonality, if we're going to use that word, which Schoenberg didn't. If we're going to see this as an atonal work, I see this as Schoenberg avoiding tonality more than finding, you know, what is the root of atonality, or in his words, total chromaticism, right? So it is beautifully artful avoidance, right? And it is, you know, really great writing. Now, the lines are just wonderful to play for the most part on these instruments. But all that aside, it's just a wonderful, epic collection of different orchestration ideas. And a lot of this stuff could be done just as easily tonally. This particular idea here of having 3-part harmony with the flutes and E-flat clarinet playing Chalumeau on the bottom, doubled with muted trumpets, and then a little bit of cushioning from below by very soft trombones, and then of course the xylophone outlining and the celesta playing along with piccolo. I mean, what a great idea. And I am certain that this has been stolen by several orchestrators or composers in the 50s and 60s who scored for such television programs such as Gunsmoke or Mission Impossible, Star Trek, Twilight Zone, Outer Limits. They were constantly dipping into material like this. So it's not as if this stuff is so incredibly alien. It's just that it's groundbreaking in the context of when this piece was composed, right? So think about all those things, especially this, which just comes and goes so quickly. The beautiful integrity of this line here, with oboes and English horn backed up by clarinets on the top 2 pitches, with the horn coming in here. This lovely little percussive gesture here on upper winds, including the E-flat clarinet. And the double basses trying their best to be heard, and then just capped off here by a snarl from our muted trombones. Think about all those things, and I'll see you on the next screen. So the next part of this lecture is going to be actually fairly long and is going to cover two screens, this one and the next one, just because it is really hard to split it up into two separate talks on this particular musical idea. So, in the first place, let's look at what is being carried over from the previous page. Once again, we have our faithful bass clarinet and bassoon playing that long chord, D major 7, omit 3. And we've also got our divisi cellos chugging away at that same pattern again. Interesting how they coalesce right here into the same notes, and at this point just really become unison parts, as other instruments pick up that A-flat C-D pattern. And then we've got a contrary motion going on in here in the divisi violas. Okay, well that's all premature. But just pointing out what is carrying over. The other thing that's carrying over is that really cool idea that I was rhapsodizing about on the previous screen. That harmonization there of first and second flute and piccolo doubled by trumpets and so on. And here, when the color gets pushed by the trumpets, that is the point at which the flutes and the piccolo clarinet are going to just disappear into the texture. They cannot compete with trumpets at all right there. The flutes would really have to be marked like triple F. Schoenberg knows they're going to be obliterated, but the piccolo on top is not. That is going to shine through very beautifully. Notice that the trombones aren't given any encouragement at all here. They actually just die off into the texture, and they don't have a crescendo marked under them. So those are the elements that are being carried over, and it's nice to see that there is a little bit of support here. We've got this low D on contrabassoon being doubled by triple F tuba, and right here we've got pizzicato D octaves in the double basses. And notice the note here, the low D natural is obligatory. Okay, so what does that mean? This note survives from the original orchestration of 1909. So C extension basses would have been something that Schoenberg could have relied on his whole life as an orchestrator. However, it's interesting to note that even as late as the middle of the 20th century, he would still have to mark this. So it was an idea that wasn't necessarily universal to all bassists, and still isn't today. There are plenty of bassists out there who still just play a 4-string bass. And they'll just play up an octave if you go below E. So right here, he's just really making sure that the divisi lower double basses play that low D natural. This is actually a pizzicato that could be played without going divisi, despite the fact that there are two voices indicated here, because the upper D is an open string, right? So the player could just kind of hook two fingers, like the third finger and the thumb, around both of those strings and just pluck. So it is possible to do this as a non-divisi kind of thing. And also, if the player sets their fourth string to D with the C extension, which is something you can do, you can just sort of set that as the bottom pitch of that string, the bass player can play up a fourth on their A string, and then the two pitches can be right next to each other, which is even more ideal for a double bassist. So anyhow, this is really doable, and it doesn't need to be divisi, is all I'm trying to say. Okay. But the real exciting thing that is happening here is not even marked Hauptstimme, but it doesn't really need to be. It is this lovely octave statement. Now, do you remember I pointed out in the last talk in this lecture about how the second violins were doing something really exciting, and it was a pity that it wasn't more in the foreground, but that it would eventually pay off on this screen. And here it is, which is playing up a minor ninth. As you can see here, it's on an E flat, up just a little bit more than an octave, from where the second violins were playing it. And it is played in octaves using the upper divisi violas. And that's also a really wonderful sound. And I like the way that the seconds come in here, and it just becomes more and more powerful, adding all of the weight to the different lines. Now, that isn't enough for Schoenberg. He has got to add even more. So we're back to our percussive, shrieking piccolo plus flute, and this time adding oboe below that. And, of course, the oboe is being doubled by the first and second clarinets. What's very cool about this is that Schoenberg makes you think that the xylophone is playing way more than it does. By hitting the beginning and the end of these phrases, he makes you sort of hear xylophone going throughout each slur. It's another bit of orchestration chicanery or sleight of hand. So by beginning and ending each slur, right, and that happens here, and then right here at the end, he makes you think you've heard it even more by just adding a note in the middle, right? That's just wonderful craft. I think that's just lovely. Just to support that from below, we've got A4 horns. They are really filling in the middle here of the sound picture as this other texture comes to an abrupt end and the trombones die away. It's a wonderful sound right in there, and it's easy for the listener to not pay attention to it, right? So when you listen to this in maybe 15 or 20 minutes when I'm through explaining everything, really listen for that middle voice there of A4 horns just blazing away here. And remember, they're still muted, so they have just a very fierce sound. And that helps to give a huge amount of resonance and shine to these cascading percussive notes here in the upper winds. Now, going on, as I mentioned before, the second violins pick up the pattern from the upper divisi cellos, of course playing an octave higher. And then we have this little counter pattern going on here in the divisi violas. But what else is happening here in terms of the accompaniment? Note that our ongoing D major 7 omit 3 chord here is just continuing on and on and on and on. It just doesn't seem like it's ever going to stop. And here it even goes down to pianissimo. But suddenly we start to see a little bit of disturbance in the line here. The bass clarinet is playing along an octave higher than the lowest of these divisi basses, which are playing that same chord an octave lower. Right? Then, as the basses start to leap up, right, they go bonk, bonk, leap up. The same thing happens with the bass clarinet, and the double basses are doubled by the contrabassoon, which then just jumps down and supplies a note even below the double basses there. At this point, the double basses are doubling the pitch of the original chord right here, right? And the bassoons just keep playing that little A major third, right? Just on and on and on and on. And then right after the double basses leap up, the bassoons leap up, right? And these higher pitches are being maintained by contrabassoon and bass clarinet, which I just want to say that contrabassoon and bass clarinet in octaves is a beautiful sound. It's quite eerie. What's wonderful about it is that the contrabassoons are supplying just a very rich bottom and cushion of their overtones. And then the bass clarinet is playing this kind of very naked sound, an octave above that. And it is just a beautifully eerie sound. Now, of course, we're not going to be able to hear that in all of this cacophony that is starting to develop. But it is still a cool idea, and it's cool the way that it's used here. And what's wonderful about these textures is that you can pick them apart with your ears, right, and listen to different elements of them, and then put them all back together just in the way that you observe it, right? And that's the wonderful thing, too, about audiating a score. That, here I'm talking about audiation again as I get to the end of the audiation course, sort of wrapping it up this week in Patreon. And that is just being able to see the different elements and to play them back in your inner ear. Even a very complex score like this, once you pick out the different elements and you just learn to listen to them and allow them to manifest in your inner ear, then you can sort of zero in on one of these effects and imagine the way that it would sound, right? And that is the way that these guys operated back before they had sound sets, right? There was a certain amount of audiation involved, even with somebody who played the piano, to work out all their ideas, like Stravinsky. You would still have to know what the instruments would sound like when you gave them the task of realizing those pitches. So that is all the window dressing around everything that is happening here in the Hauptstimme. Let's look at that Hauptstimme. So we are seeing more developments of that opening theme here, pretty much sticking to a formula that we saw before at the beginning, right? And that is first and second oboe plus English horn, with those top two notes being doubled by the clarinets, right? So that just continues on, and we see the piccolo clarinet coming in here to double the top of the line. So that is just like a second first clarinet, if you know what I mean. Meanwhile, we have a counterpoint coming from the horns. And what I think is wonderful about this is that there is so much counterpoint in this work. And one of the things that I hear in a lot of beginning efforts of atonality is there is very commendable focus on texture and timbre, and I think that is absolutely great. But there tends not to be a very developed sense of counterpoint, right? And I'm not critiquing everybody who is just starting to write in an atonal style or a total chromatic style, to put it in Schoenberg's terms. That is something I would just say, look, work on that, right? Just try to think of this atonal style as being something that can still have conversations and relationships of motion and everything else. In fact, there's an entire book on atonal counterpoint, right? So really try to think of motion, contrary motion, and all the different strategies that a contrapuntist puts at play. They still apply, even though consonance has been removed from the equation to a great degree. All right, so having said that, I still think that this is really ingenious. Now here you're seeing some 1-3-2-4 scoring, right? And here is a perfect place to put it. We've got some vertical compression here on the original page. It's just a lot to organize. And so Schoenberg arranges this so that the first and the third are playing this Hauptstimme line right here, and the second and fourth horns are harmonizing from below. And it just really provides this beautiful conversation here between the two elements of high, strong, but yet very fluid winds, reeds really, when we've taken the flutes out, and the horns below. And this is the kind of orchestration that we have seen all along in this movement. We see in The Rite of Spring. So I'm not really familiar with how much Stravinsky might have been exposed to Schoenberg's score. He later on followed Schoenberg down the path of serialism and 12-tone and so on. He made that a part of his style after his neoclassical period. But I am not too familiar with any possible influence of Stravinsky from this score on The Rite of Spring. And I feel that that is kind of a rabbit hole, right? To know that this was going on probably would even just be enough for Stravinsky. And when this work was finally composed and premiered and everything else in 1909, Stravinsky was already working on the Rite of Spring and developing the principles and everything else. He was already the orchestrator that he needed to be in order to compose the Rite of Spring. So I don't feel that it is really a productive conversation to explore how much he might have been influenced. Does, one thing depend upon another? I think that the concept of percussive gestures and upper winds and these kinds of relationships are just ones that would eventually arise from the individual styles and approaches of both composers, right? So I don't think that it's a case of Stravinsky borrowing from Schoenberg, really, even if he was aware of that score, which that hasn't been part of my research. I'm really focused on what is happening in the orchestra, right? More than the context around it these days. Okay, so it's almost like this is part 1A, 1B, and 1C, all right, of this particular huge episode. Here we start to get these flurries now in our upper reeds, oboes, English horn, and clarinet, and that is all leading up to this beautiful, massive sound here, and those flurries are being supported from below by third trumpet, okay? So we have this massive punching sound, just as much as we had counterpoint going between the ideas here going on in the upper reeds and the horns. Now we've got the piccolos and flutes and E-flat clarinet having a conversation with A2 trumpets. And that is all they need to do. As you will see, the flurries themselves start to be played in a certain kind of counterpoint, right? We've got the trombones here kind of diving back and forth, and this really does feel a lot like scoring that you might run into in, say, like the introduction from the Rite of Spring. Did Schoenberg influence Stravinsky? This might be something that you would point to, though I don't really feel that they really sound all that much alike. They're just some similar strategies. Okay, so our flurries are relating to each other in counterpoint, and the actual Hauptstimme is also relating contrapuntally, right? And notice that all it takes is just fortissimo A2 trumpets to balance against this massive stack of very high winds. Piccolos, E-flat clarinet. I try to avoid saying piccolo clarinet because it just gets confusing in these lectures when you have actual piccolos that they're relating to. The E-flat clarinet is doubling the flutes at that very high register for the flutes, and that's a wonderful combination too in octaves below the piccolos, which you will hear for yourself. What's really great here is the role of the xylophone, which is basically just underlining or doubling and very much stressing the key points for the trumpet. Not every single note, right? But just really, when the trumpets land on a note that is really going to be emphasized, they get a xylophone stroke right on top of it. And it has just the most wonderful effect. If you want to talk about this influencing somebody, look at Prokofiev, all right? So like the use of xylophone in this really feels prescient of how Prokofiev would develop as an orchestrator. Although, once again, you could sort of say, oh, well, xylophone, that's just would be a typical thing anyway. And I'm not claiming that Prokofiev was influenced by this either, right? But it really does feel prescient to me, especially in the context of this freer approach to harmony. So let's just continue looking at how those two instrumental groups relate to each other, right? So piccolos and flutes and E-flat clarinet are really going pretty high in their range, just really getting higher and higher and higher. And here they are going all the way up to high C, which for the E-flat clarinet is a high A, and that is considered as the textbook high note for E-flat clarinet. Like, try not to get above that, right, if you are really scoring stuff like this. And it is a hugely piercing sound. And, of course, Schoenberg is just giving them free rein dynamically. Say, yeah, go ahead, play into it. Triple F, right? Go for it. That is where you want to be. Meanwhile, the trumpets are sort of playing their contrapuntal line against that, and eventually coming in, which I think is very, very cool, on their own note here. And as I was mentioning before, accompanied by xylophone to a certain extent, but then, after that it just kind of becomes pointless. But look at how that line by the trumpets does not need any help from anybody, except for stuff around it, like, say, these horns sort of heroically playing their gesture from over here, which I'll explain in a minute. Just being part of when this note hits, like that is when they choose to start, right? But there really isn't any kind of doubling or window dressing or anything else. And look, that is just telling you, that is teaching you the awesome power of the heavy brass. It is such a powerful resource. One trombone can, like, obliterate most of the wins in a contest. I mean, I see so many scores where the brass, they're just playing happily along with everybody else in a way that, if we're really put to the test, would just, like, wipe everybody else out. So unless you are scoring something like this, where every instrument is in its absolute strongest position, then you want to be careful about telling the trumpets that they can play as loud as they like. And in fact, Schoenberg doesn't, does he? Does he say triple F here? He is leaving it up to the trumpets to find their place in this harmonic picture, or this, in this textural picture here. And they will find their own balance right in there. So it might be subjective to an extent, right? Just really leaving it up to them to find out where they need to go. Okay, so we've talked about that. Now let's just note that the flurries are continuing on in the other reed instruments, right? So the oboes being doubled by the clarinets with the English horn below, right? And then, of course, we've also got the third trumpet playing along in the middle there, providing the upper voice to the English horn, which is going to sound down a fifth from written, right? So it's that same sort of parallel fifths going on. It must have delighted Schoenberg to put in as many parallel fifths as he liked, right? He was just throwing out the rule book, and that's great. Of course, he had his own set of rules. Then against them, we've got the trombones, and they don't need to have this huge stack here to help them out, or they don't need any kind of help, just like the trumpets playing this Hauptstimme here. We've got them just sort of tootling along here, and they don't really get their triple F sign until right here, right? Just right at the very end, just to be on the safe side. So that pretty much covers, like, the flurries and the featured lines. So what else is happening here? Well, there's still quite a bit. Now, you recall our ongoing D major 7 omit 3 chord, right? So when we last checked in with it, we had the double basses playing an octave above where the bassoons and bass clarinet were originally positioned, and as we see here, the bassoons and bass clarinet have jumped up to that same position. But they are still kind of jumping back and forth here. And so are the basses, but not exactly in sync with each other. Some of them are jumping down earlier than others and doing it in different ways, right? And then holding on to this high position in the double basses while the lower winds are still kind of grinding around in the basement, and then they jump up and so on. To add yet another element, let's mention those French horns now. Now this looks like it is an A major 7th omit 3 chord, but it is actually that same D because of the transposition of down a fifth, from written pitches of the horns. And we're keeping that same configuration, right? Of 1 and 3 doubling the top and 2 and 4 playing fifths on the bottom. Here they heroically interject their particular idea, which is yet another octave above by the time it leaps up to here, right? So we have this harmony below cushioning and jumping back and forth. And since it isn't really consonant with everything else that is going on necessarily, I mean, just here and there, but not in terms of an ongoing harmonic strategy, they can just be what they are, right? And that is one of the great liberating things of being free from that. Now, I completely am not promoting it or underplaying it or anything. I'm completely not taking a position on whether or not you should compose in this harmonic style. And to be absolutely honest about this, I am a tonal populist. I am the kind of composer that Schoenberg would have dreaded to know would exist 100 years after this was premiered. I'm totally coming from a different place, but I love all music, and I can see the intelligence and the struggle and the effort and the ingenuity and all of those things in this score, and it delights me. And there are many things that I can take from the lessons that Schoenberg has here. In fact, I feel like I have learned as much from music that is not like mine than from music that is like mine. And in fact, I feel like my biggest leap forward in terms of my style was when I really started listening to everybody's music and absorbing it and appreciating it and reviewing it and talking and thinking about it. And that just really pushed me, I feel, to where my eventual style would settle. Okay, but enough about me. So that same idea is coming in right here, but notice how, to a certain extent, the double basses have got to let go of this. So aside from kind of underlining it a little bit here, fortissimo piano, we've got a D fifth here happening. It's being a little bit underplayed here, right? Like sempre pianissimo. It's as if Schoenberg is sort of letting the players back off a little bit on it, some players. Or maybe this sort of represents what could have been carried forth by the double basses if there was another section of them, right? That's because they get to shine right here. Well, we will get to that in a minute. Meanwhile, timpani, fortissimo piano, C sharp and D, alternating strokes between the two drums as quickly as possible. And I feel that it has to be a tight tremolo when you have that, because it's not like a drum roll, right, where you're playing the same pitch and you are hitting the sticks on the same surface. You're spreading it out between two different pitches, and that can actually have a seesawing effect if the pitches are very, very far apart. But they aren't in this case. They are right next to each other, and they're practically the same pitch to the listener, right? So it can create a noisy roll. This wouldn't be something that I would recommend doing in very consonant music, but I would say that if you are kind of escaping tonality a little bit, it could be a really fun effect to have like a half-step tremolo. The patterning is continuing on with the strings, and then here they all join together and just decide, hey, let's try to take the castle too, right? And there's this wonderful leap up. And I feel that the string writing for these past two screens has been, worthy of Bartók. It really reminds me a lot of Bartók. And, this would be a case where I would say, yeah, I bet you anything Bartók knew about this score very, very well. And not to say that he was imitating it, but he would have found freedom to do similar things in his own full-blown orchestrations. There's something that's actually very similar in the Concerto for Orchestra, as a matter of fact. That pretty much describes everything that has happened all the way up to right here, where everybody just stops dead. And it's almost as if Schoenberg is saying, oh, hey, by the way, do you remember that harmony that has been going throughout here for the entire time? That little sort of D fifth and the A third on top and everything? Here we've got old notation, even though this score would have been composed in the new notation era. We still have old notation here, so this is going to be written down a fourth from the intended pitches, right? So this is just that same old A third, right? It's these pitches right here. First and third, second and fourth, they are divvying this up along to the tuba, flutter-tonguing tuba. Isn't that cool? And the third trombone. And it just has the most wonderfully raspy, obnoxious Bronx cheer that you could possibly imagine. I really love that. So what happens after that? You will just have to wait until our next lecture. So listen for all of those things. There are too many to list, but just in a general way, listen for the contrapuntal relationships between the flurries right? These flurries between the trombones and the upper reed instruments and third trumpet. Listen for the relationship, the contrapuntal relationship once again, between the very high winds and just A2 trumpets who can stand on their own. And really listen to how strongly A2 trumpets can stand on their own against a massive texture like this. See if you can actually hear this. These forte piano, fortissimo, pianissimo accents here carrying through that harmony once again. And of course you'll be able to hear this big raz here on this last bar. It's very, very hard to mistake. And then, of course, as the music starts, you'll hear the end of that texture I was raving about earlier. And just the wonderful entrance of the strings here. That kind of Bartokian idea in retrospect. And the horns kind of helping out here underneath, right in this middle voice, which I really want you to think about. The way that the xylophone tricks you into thinking that it's playing all the way through when it's just really kind of bookending each of these slurs. And then finally adding a middle voice there. And then this wonderful line as well, like the way that there's counterpoint in here between those same elements that we heard on the previous screen and the horns, kind of presaging what is going to happen in a huge way by the end of this screen. Listen for all that, and just like I said before, you don't have to just let the video go on through into the credits. You can just back up and watch and listen to these particular excerpts again and again and again, if you like. And just note all the different kinds of things. This is such complex, such multi-layered orchestration, and in other ways it's quite simple and straightforward, isn't it? Right? When you really break it down and see that there might only be maybe 3 or 4 elements happening on each page. It's just that the harmonic contexts of each line, since they don't necessarily relate to each other in a consonant way, makes it seem like it is a big mishmash of sound at first. But after a while you start to pick out the different lines and to really learn from them and to see how they relate to each other, without having to worry about following certain rules, right? So enjoy this, and I will see you soon for part 3 of Movement 1 of Schoenberg's 5 Pieces for Orchestra.